Quiznos once had over 5,000 locations across America. Today, they have fewer than 200. That is a decline of more than 96%. And it happened to a company that, for a moment, actually beat Subway in a taste test. So, how does a chain with a better sandwich lose 96% of itself in under 20 years? The answer isn't bad luck. It's a business model that was designed to profit off failure. Quiznos was founded in 1981 in Denver, Colorado, by a chef named Jimmy Lambados. The concept was simple. While Subway served cold sandwiches, Quiznos toasted theirs, running them through a conveyor oven that crisped the bread and melted the cheese. It sounds small, but in the world of fast food, it was a real point of difference, and customers noticed. Through the 90s and into the 2000s, Quiznos exploded. By 2006, it had passed 5,000 locations and had become the second largest subchain in North America, trailing only Subway. Aggressive franchise sales, a memorable, if bizarre, ad campaign, and a product people genuinely preferred all pushed Quiznos toward the top. For a brief window, it looked like Subway finally had a real challenger, but underneath that growth was a structure that would eventually collapse the entire system, and it started with something most customers never saw: the supply chain. Quiznos required every single franchisee to buy their food, their packaging, even their napkins, through a company-owned distributor called Rego Foods. There was no option to shop around. No comparing prices. You bought from Rego at Rego's prices, or you didn't open your doors, and those prices were not competitive. Independent analysis from later litigation found Rego was charging franchisees 10 to 20% above standard market rates for the exact same products a Subway or Firehouse Subs operator could get elsewhere for less. 10 to 20% might not sound catastrophic, but in the restaurant business, food cost is everything. A healthy sandwich shop keeps food costs around 28 to 32% of revenue. Once you're paying an inflated markup on every single ingredient, that number climbs to 35, even 40% before you've accounted for waste or spoilage. For a location doing $400,000 a year, that markup alone could mean $12,000 to $15,000 a year flowing straight to the parent company, whether or not the franchisee ever turned a profit. And that's the part that mattered most. Quiznos made money from the supply chain no matter what happened to the store. Whether a franchisee thrived or went bankrupt, Rego got paid. The corporation had no real incentive to make sure individual locations actually succeeded. Layer royalties and advertising fees on top of that markup, and you get a franchisee who is paying out before they've sold a single sandwich. Now put that same franchisee up against Subway, which spent the mid-2000s running the $5 footlong, one of the most aggressive value campaigns fast food has ever seen. A Subway operator buying ingredients at market rate could actually make $5 work. A Quiznos operator, paying 20% more for the same bread and meat, simply couldn't. Every time Subway cut prices, Quiznos franchisees lost customers they had no way of winning back. There was another problem baked into the growth itself, one that had nothing to do with Subway at all. Quiznos sold territories so aggressively during its expansion phase that many markets became oversaturated, with multiple locations competing for the same small pool of customers within a few city blocks of each other. Instead of growing the overall pie, new stores simply carved up the existing one into thinner and thinner slices. A franchisee who had sunk their savings into what looked like a booming brand could watch a second. Then a third Quiznos opened nearby, each one quietly, cannibalizing the sales they needed to survive. Then 2008 hit, and the recession did what inflated food costs and oversaturation together hadn't quite finished. Consumers pulled back on the slightly more premium, slightly more expensive sandwich chain. Same-store sales collapsed. 700 locations closed in 2009 alone, another 800 closed the year after that. Owners were selling off ovens and equipment on Craigslist for pennies on the dollar, just trying to recover something before walking away entirely. If you're new here, we do deep dives just like this one into companies that looked unstoppable and quietly fell apart. Consider subscribing, it genuinely helps us keep making these. By 2009, private equity had taken over, and like so many leveraged buyouts, it loaded an already struggling company with even more debt, hundreds of millions of dollars worth. Franchisees, furious about years of Rego overcharges, banded together and filed class action lawsuits, alleging the company had misrepresented food costs during the sales process and had broken its duty of good faith to the very people funding its growth. Quiznos ultimately paid out more than $300 million in settlements, money it did not have, on top of debt it already couldn't service. In an act of desperation in 2012, the company sold majority control to Avenue Capital. It wasn't enough. By March of 2014, Quiznos filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, wiping out roughly $400 million in debt. Restructuring saved the corporation. It did essentially nothing for the thousands of franchisees who had already lost their life savings. Their claims were unsecured, subordinate to the institutional lenders, and most walked away with nothing. Here's the number that tells you everything about how badly this model failed, the people who bought into it. Quiznos franchisees have recorded a 42.2% default rate on their small business administration loans. The average across the entire franchise industry is 10 to 12%. Quiznos franchisees defaulted at 3 to 4 times the normal rate. That means, for every 10 people who took out an SBA loan to open a Quiznos, more than 4 lost their business and were left personally liable for whatever the government hadn't covered. A typical Quiznos investment ran $200,000 to $300,000. Multiply that by the number of locations that opened and closed over 2 decades, and you're looking at a wealth destruction machine disguised as a sandwich franchise, and here's the twist that makes it worse. None of this was hidden. Not entirely. Franchise disclosure documents are legally required to reveal exactly this kind of information. Item 8 disclosed the mandatory rego purchasing requirement, though it never made clear just how large that markup actually was. Item 20, which tracks store openings against store closings, had been quietly signaling a system in decline for years before the bankruptcy filing. The tools to see this coming existed. Almost nobody who signed a franchise agreement was reading them that closely or paying a lawyer to interpret them before writing a check for their life savings. So what happened to the corporate side? The people actually running Quiznos while franchisees were closing stores and defaulting on loans. Unlike a company such as Adobe, where a long-tenured chief executive eventually had to answer for years of consumer complaints, Quiznos never had that single reckoning moment. Instead, it had something arguably worse. Ownership changed hands repeatedly, private equity firm after private equity firm cycling through, extracting what value remained, restructuring, and moving on. Nobody stayed long enough to be held accountable for the wreckage. The franchisees who lost everything rarely got a name to blame, just a rotating cast of investment firms. By 2017, the location count had fallen from that 2007 peak of 4,700 all the way down to under 400, and the bleeding never fully stopped. Today, in 2026, Quiznos operates fewer than 200 locations worldwide. In 2018, a firm called High Bluff Capital Partners bought what remained, and to their credit, they stopped chasing scale. Instead, they leaned into what's left, opening smaller footprints inside convenience stores and gas stations, pushing into ghost kitchens built purely for delivery apps, and launching a loyalty program called Toasty Points to try to claw back some digital relevance. The menu still leans on the same premium positioning that once made Quiznos stand out: oven-toasted bread, black Angus steak, artisan rolls, priced a notch above Subway, and roughly in line with Jersey Mike's and Firehouse Subs. It's a survivable niche. It is not a comeback in any meaningful sense. A brand that once had 4,700 locations now measures success in the low hundreds, and the strategy isn't growth, it's damage control dressed up as reinvention. So here's the real lesson underneath the Quiznos story. This wasn't a company that failed because customers stopped liking the product. People liked the toasted sub. Some genuinely preferred it to Subway. Quiznos failed because its own business model was structured to profit from the franchisor, squeezing the franchisee dry, regardless of whether that franchisee ever made a dollar. A parent company that gets paid the same whether its partners succeed or fail has no reason to actually want them to succeed. Quiznos didn't need customers to abandon it to collapse. All it needed was to keep charging the people who believed in it just a little more than they could survive, for just long enough. Quiznos proved that a better sandwich means nothing if the model behind it is designed to bleed out the very people selling it. If you want to see what that same pattern looks like when it happens to a company everyone still assumes is thriving, we've got a video breaking down how Subway's own franchisees are living through a strikingly similar squeeze right now. Click that one next.